Hello, everyone. My name is David Villar, and welcome to this presentation on a topic that experts say can threaten the very core of modern medicine and the sustainability of any effective medical response to the threat of infectious diseases. If you think about it, we need antimicrobials not only to cure diseases, but to ensure that procedures like surgeries or chemotherapy can be provided at low risk. And as we will see, the problem lies in that we have been really misusing and overusing antimicrobials in both humans and animals, and that really plays a major role in the development of resistant organisms. And at the moment, we have very few medications to replace them in the pipeline. So, unless we want to head towards a post antibiotic era in which simple infections could once again kill, we really need to start using them in a more judicious way to ensure that they will remain effective in the future. So I'm going to focus on the consequences of overusing antimicrobials. You see a picture of a pig, a cattle, and a chicken, because these are the three main animal producing species in which they have and continue to be used as growth promoters. And as you can see, the clinical implications for humans are that we're going to have more human illnesses with treatment failures because of antimicrobial resistant organisms. Examples could be the increasing resistance by many zoonotic infection agents like Salmonella, Campylobacter, E. coli, which are linked to the use of antimicrobials in animals. For example, CDC is constantly warning of emerging strains of Salmonella that come from animals and are already multi-drug resistant because we use the same antimicrobials in animals that we need to treat ourselves. The same goes for increased mortality. The predictions are that every year there is going to be more and more people ended up in the cemetery because they get sick with one of these multi-drug resistant bugs for which there are really no drugs left to be given, or we may just be too late in the course of the disease to save those people. Obviously, increased cost may come from the need of additional treatment, longer hospitalizations, more diagnostic tests, and so on. When we talk about reduced efficacy of related antibiotics, I guess the classical example was the use of avoparcin in animals as a growth promoter that was causing resistance to vancomycin, which is a glycopeptide antimicrobial, which is used sometimes as a last line of defenses against resistant gram-positive bacteria. Increased carriage and dissemination of some resistant bacteria. Here, the classical example is methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which can be maintained in livestock and can actually spread and transmit to humans and vice versa. This is definitely one of those bacteria that you don't want to acquire in the intensive care unit if you have some type of weakness or frailty of some type. So basically, close contact with livestock is a risk factor for you to carry this type of bacteria. And finally, facilitated emergence of resistance. Basically, this refers to the movement of genes of resistance between bacteria. This is particularly relevant in the gastrointestinal tract, which appears to be the ideal environment. And there are definitely many studies showing movements of these resistant genes from one type of bacteria, you name it, E. coli to enterococci or listeria or salmonella and so forth. And selection of resistant bacteria is very likely to occur at sites like the gut or the skin microbiome. And even when you have a resolution of an infection following an antimicrobial therapy, you may have still created resistant bacteria in the normal flora. So just to show you an example of what I'm talking about, in 1997, the National Antimicrobial Resistance Monitoring System that was launched a year earlier in the US, they started monitoring the prevalence of resistance among Campylobacter in humans, and they concluded that this is a typical example of resistance that results from the use of antimicrobials in food animals, in this case, chickens. And if we look at the graph in humans, the prevalence of resistant Campylobacter was 13% in 1997, and it went up to 19% in 2001. And the first fluoroquinolones were approved for use in poultry in 1995. So the conclusion from these surveillance studies, as you can imagine, were that the use of fluoroquinolones in chicken were compromising the use of this important class of antimicrobials in humans. And because people who seek medical attention were prescribed fluoroquinolones were likely not responding so well to the medication. Finally, FDA decided not to approve enrofloxacin for poultry any longer, and that was done back in 2000. So the issue of antimicrobial resistance is something that worries all the major health authorities. Here you can see all the three main world health organizations that have come together, and they put a global action plan that was launched in 2015, and they're trying to address this challenge of antimicrobial resistance through a One Health approach, in which they basically have everyone involved, not just the healthcare professionals. And if we look at this action plan in more detail, it has five major strategic objectives. The number one is to improve awareness and understanding of antimicrobial resistance, obviously through communication, education, training. The second one is to strengthen knowledge and evidence through more surveillance and research. Obviously, we need to know what's happening on a day-to-day basis. Third one is to reduce the incidence of infection through effective sanitation, hygiene, and prevention measures. Quite simple. If we lower the occurrence of disease, the pressure to use antimicrobials can be similarly reduced. The fourth one, which is to optimize the use of antimicrobials in humans and animal health. This one will be the one that we'll focus on later videos. But when we refer to the optimal use, we're not just talking about achieving maximal clinical efficacy as we have always done, but nowadays we have to include balancing such efficacy with a minimal risk of creating antimicrobial resistance, and not only in the strain which is causing the infection, but also in the patient's normal or commensal microbiota. I know this is easier said than done, but there are better ways of using antimicrobials that will help reduce this resistance from happening. And finally, to develop the economic case for a sustainable investment that takes account of the needs of all the countries, and to increase the investment in new medicines, diagnostic tools, vaccines, and whatever interventions we can come up with. So as I mentioned in future videos, we will address how to make better use of antimicrobials to prevent resistance. But the first thing that we should know is what is actually driving or causing most of that resistance. Because obviously the concept of implementing optimal use evolves around knowing what causes it in the first place. So we're going to divide it into three things. And the first one is obviously going to start by reducing the overall volume of antimicrobials. And this one, we could simply start by saying that having better regulation and oversight of the sales and use, particularly in countries where they can be easily attained over the counter, and there are no control efforts, and let alone any surveillance regarding how they use it in food animals, could be a good start. The second one would be to stop using it as a growth promotion. Believe it or not, the vast amount of antimicrobials are not used for therapeutic purposes, but really for growth promotion, particularly in pigs and poultry. We have these factory farming systems in which we keep animals confined and we dose them constantly with antimicrobials, not only to keep them disease free, but to make them gain weight faster. And if you'd like to read more on this issue, this guideline here by WHO is excellent on the overall use of medically important antimicrobials in food producing animals. I'll make this article available on VetMed Academy and also on the reference list at the end of this presentation. But in a nutshell, what they advocate is to totally restrict or discontinue the use of antimicrobials as growth promoters. The second thing is to not use antimicrobials for disease prevention in healthy animals. And also, the third thing is not to use antimicrobials, which are critically important for humans in food producing animals, unless there is no other better option indicated by a susceptibility test. So this is not only World Health Organization, but also all the medical associations that are in line with these guidelines. So just to show you an example of what I'm talking about, the more tetracycline that it was used on this study as a growth promoter in cattle, the more resistant E. coli that they detected on their gastrointestinal tract. So obviously reducing in general the overall consumption of antimicrobials will in of itself reduce the level of resistant bacteria. Now the problem is that there are very few countries in the world taking really measures to do so. And I'm gonna blow up this second graph here so you can see better. At least Europe and the US seem to be doing the right thing. But if we look at countries like China, Brazil, and India, the projections are that they will almost double their use of antimicrobials by the year 2030 for livestock. And this is mostly as growth promoters, obviously. In Europe, the use of antimicrobials as a growth promotion was officially banned in 2001. And Denmark has become actually the international leader in the fight against antimicrobial resistance. They do monitor all the sales and resistant trends in humans and animals. And the funny thing is that by removing antimicrobials as growth promoters in pigs, they show no negative consequences on profits. At the very beginning, they showed some increases in post-weaning diarrhea, which requires some interventions in changes in feeding and weaning procedures. But basically, their models are outstanding, very competitive, and they are doing really well after the ban. So, how about the regulation in the US? Well, between 2014 and 2016, the FDA implemented a voluntary plan with industry to phase out antimicrobials, and it didn't really seem to work out because, as you can see on this table, the tons of medically important antibiotics for use in food animals continue to increase. So basically, at the start of 2017, all the medically important antimicrobials were no longer allowed for use as growth promotion. And the base and on all the uses had to be used for a clear therapeutic purposes with veterinary supervision, whether it was to treat animals that exhibited a clinical disease or animals in which morbidity or mortality had exceeded a certain baseline, or for prevention when the risk was too high of becoming sick. And as I said before, WHO is even recommended not using the critically important antimicrobials for disease treatment and control unless there is a specific susceptibility test that demonstrate that this is really the only drug option available. So what are those critically important antimicrobials? Well, here we have a list by FDA of medically important antimicrobials, which are, as you can see, ranked by a group of experts into critically, highly important, and non-medically important. And as you can imagine, the last ones, which are at least in the US, the ones that remain to be used as growth promoters. And I guess probably the main category here are the ionophores, which are obviously not used in human medicine. And this FDA list is very similar to the classification by the WHO, which I know it's very difficult to see on this slide here. But basically, both lists are virtually identical. I just wanted to show you this other one that was put together by WHO in 2016. And as you can imagine, the idea is to preserve those antimicrobials that are considered of most importance for humans, and that should be used as a last line of defense, if you like, in life-threatening situations. In a nutshell, they recommend that when you plan on using antimicrobials, to do so with based on what the laboratory is telling you, with a susceptibility test, and always try to preserve those that are of most importance for human medicine. So, which are those that are most important? Well, if we go to back to the FDA list, just remember that the fluoroquinolones, the macrolides, and the third and fourth generation cephalosporins are really the ones that should be preserved as a last resort, so to speak, and when there are no better options available. We can also reduce antimicrobials in other type of applications like prophylaxis or metaphylaxis. In this respect, we will have some videos showing specific examples like doing better diagnostics in weaning of piglets, which can help us reduce the use of antimicrobials to treat diarrhea. We will also present how we can precondition your calves before transportation by doing good vaccination and weaning programs so that we don't need to treat them when they arrive to a feedlot. We will also present some alternatives to dry cow therapy, which don't involve the use of antimicrobials. And there are a lot of different conditions in small animal practice which we tend to overuse or misuse antimicrobials, which are also a good opportunity to reduce the overall use of antimicrobials in general. And finally, avoiding unnecessary therapy. This can always be done by preventing and controlling infections. Uh, Obviously, good management, vaccination, biosecurity. This is always the best way to reduce the need of using antimicrobials. So when we refer to the drug type driving resistance, basically we're talking about using antimicrobials without any laboratory backup to tell us what the susceptibility of that bacteria is. We should probably start relying more on laboratories to tell us what to use instead of doing empirical treatment, especially when we use drugs that are critically important by WHO standards. And just to remind you which ones those are, remember fluoroquinolones, macrolides, and third and fourth generation cephalosporin. So on this second point, basically, is just to highlight the importance of starting using laboratories to tell us what drugs we should be using and try to move away from doing empirical treatments. And the final point, which has really been a major shift from the way it's been done for decades, is that the latest trend is that treatment should be avoided after clinical resolution of symptoms. Because the longer the treatments, the greater the chances of developing resistance on the commensal microbiota. As I say, this has really changed from the way it used to be. Now the doctor may tell you to stop taking the medication when you feel much better, and not until it was initially prescribed for. So that's a trend that has really changed in the last years. As a final thought, how do we translate everything that we just said into practical guidelines that could be used in our day-to-day practice? Well, obviously, we need to focus on animal species and disease-specific recommendations. We should probably highlight the current practices, which may be incorrect, or where we may need to do further testing to implement an optimal antimicrobial use. So we will try to address these in future videos. So I'm going to wrap up here. These are the references that I used to prepare this video. I hope this initial presentation was useful to set up the stage. So until next video, I'm just gonna dismiss you here. So bye bye and take care. Bye bye.